Master, Your Excellency, Alderman, Sheriff, Chief Commoner, my lords, ladies and gentlemen. Can I say before I start what an intimidating act the sheriff is to follow? Before we came into the room, he said I was to be the straight man, so we know which role he chose for himself. And it's a really great privilege for me to be standing here before you in this quite magnificent hall. And it's an honor to be giving the Tacitus Lecture. Now, how great an honor has been impressed upon me almost on an hourly basis. I understand that I am only the fourth woman to be given this great honor and privilege, and perhaps it mirrors the fact that I am the fourth woman to be elected as an alderman in this great city of London. But there is nothing more intimidating than to be told by friends and colleagues alike how much you are going to enjoy this privilege and how much they are looking forward to it. And on every occasion I was told that, my trepidation increased. Because, as some of you will know, I'm also the first person from an ethnic minority to be invited to do this too. Now, I was born in a tiny but exquisitely beautiful island in the Caribbean, the island of Dominica. And it's probably the only island in the archipelago which Columbus would still recognize, because nothing's changed. Now, I was transplanted from Dominica into the sunny uplands of firstly West London's Paddington and then brought up in Walthamstow in the East End of London. And you all know that only good things come out of Walthamstow. And so I am truly a child of the Commonwealth. So it is an awesome burden that has been given to me. And I was told by a very dear friend who is also an alderman, and I'm just scanning the audience to see if I can see him so I can out him, that having been appointed as an alderman on the 9th of December of last year, for my first year in office, I should ideally be seen and not heard. Which I confess, having spent all the years at the bar, seemed rather an attractive prospect. Either way, it appeared unnecessary for me to burden the court with my voice. But here I am, thanks to the world traders, who have invited me to break every rule in the book. Now, since I'm a Skinner, I wondered whether they had a cunning plan. However, I suspect that they may have been inspired by Tacitus himself, who was also a lawyer, a politician, and a renowned orator. And some tell me a perfectly fine example of troublemaking that I intend to emulate. But despite this, his name literally means silence. So I am here to break my silence as an alderman and to speak on a theme similar to that which I made my maiden speech in the Lords way back in 1998. But this time, at the request of a distinguished livery that is modern in its approach, has an outward focus and a real sense of internationalism, a description equally true of the city of London itself. So We live in challenging and troubling times. Every aspect of our lives questioned, mulled over, dissected. Is this the best we can do? What should we change? What should we keep? What is good? What is bad? Who and in what should we now trust? And why? Are the systems that have served our forebearers still worthy of investment? And how do we secure our personal and financial safety and stability in a world that is changing more rapidly than ever before? What of our children? What kind of world will they inherit? Who decides? And hence the question, in all this tumult, do we need the city? As all of you know, I am a lawyer to my fingertips. Therefore, when any question is asked, I have to disaggregate it into its component parts, of which this question has at least 2, maybe 3. First, who are the we to whom the question refers? What is meant by need? And third, to which city does the question allude? Because if we just look at this packed hall tonight, there are literally hundreds of us gathered here. Many representing liveries, companies, banks, accountancy firms, insurers, schools, charities, institutions, parliamentarians, councillors, and many, many more. And not all of us in this room live within the old Roman walls of the city itself. But I don't think that matters, because all of us here, we represent more than the square mile. We represent Greater London. We also represent the regions of England. We represent the whole of the United Kingdom. We represent Europe. We represent the 53 countries of the Commonwealth, which we all know has 30% of the world's population and more than 15% of the world's GDP, and between 10 and 15% of the work we trade between our Commonwealth partners, we trade to advantage. But, and I definitely do not want to sound glib when I say this, we also represent the world. And if you just look to either your left or your right, you will find the world here, amongst our midst. In fact, we, both residents and commuters, are a kaleidoscope of diverse cultures, ethnicities, religions, sexual orientations, and identities, a veritable mini Commonwealth, united in our shared daily experience of this small city and ceremonial county within Greater London. And so, when we question who needs the city, I genuinely believe that the answer encompasses a huge swathes of people who are touched by its businesses, by its heritage, by its good work, by its infrastructure, and most importantly, by its people. And those people come from every country around the globe, because the city isn't just a square mile. It's a hub of financial services that has been developed over the centuries by many, many generations of people. At the center of that hub are the 14,000 companies based right here in the square mile. London employs 700,000 people in financial services alone. More international companies are listed on the London Stock Exchange than on any other. And yet, the city spreads further still. 2 million people are employed in the financial services across the United Kingdom, including over 30,000 in each of the cities of Birmingham, Bristol, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Leeds, and Manchester. Collectively, they are driving the British economy, contributing over £65 billion in tax revenue to the UK exchequer, attracting more foreign direct investment than any other sector, generating a trade surplus of £55 billion, trading twice as many euros as the rest of Europe combined, specializing in banking, insurance, fund management, securities, derivatives, and foreign exchange, building an ever-evolving, sophisticated legal system, illustrated at this week's Global Law Summit with speakers of the very highest caliber from the four corners of the globe, improving an already tremendous infrastructure, housing great universities, all of which have drawn the best people, not just from London, but from around the world. So this gathering of excellence has generated its own ecosystem. Law firms, accountants, management consultants, and other professionals have moved to be nearby. And the legal profession alone generates an annual trade surplus over £3 billion. So when in Henry IV, Part 2, it says, kill all the lawyers first, I'd hesitate. Transport links are outstanding, but not all. But I think they can also always be improved, and the Crossrail project demonstrates that really in an exemplary way. So there is much to be proud of, and the city has established its own traditions, its own institutions, a common language, and inevitably it has developed its own culture, a culture that spans geographical boundaries and national identities. In the city, over 100 languages are spoken. The Office of National Statistics defines 53 of those languages as main, in which the streets down which we walk remind us of our multicultural heritage. Italian in Lombard Street, Danish in Gutter Lane. Wherever we look, wherever we walk, wherever we live, there are echoes of the Commonwealth and our multicultural, multi-ethnic heritage. From India and Africa, the Caribbean, China, Bangladesh, name a country, and you will find its root here. So there is no country on earth that is not represented within the city. So what happens here in this financial hub we call the city is of vital importance, far, far beyond the square mile, or the boundaries even of this nation. No wonder we are an international hub in which Islamic finance can flourish happily alongside that of the offshore renminbi. This hasn't happened overnight. London, as you've already heard, has always been a global city. Tacitus himself referred to a great Londinium, a great trading centre, and every wave of migration over the past 2 millennia has left its fingerprint on the fabric of the city and the fabric of London and the United Kingdom. The Anglo-Saxons established it as a place of trade. The Danes used it as a base for government. The Normans granted it a charter formalizing its rights, privileges, and laws. And bridges appeared over the Thames, each a breathtaking feat of engineering 800 years ago. The Magna Carta was signed, and this is a very special year for us, with London the only city to be mentioned within its lines. So within a century, trade in the city was being divided between the great guilds which elected the Lord Mayor. And remember how amazing that moment was when the demand was not that the mayor would be appointed by the king, but the people of the city would elect a mayor of their own choosing. So commerce continued to flourish through the mercantilism of the 16th century and beyond, into the Indies, Africa, the Americas, and the Bank of England and the Lloyds of London were both established in the 17th, adding further colour and structure to the city's rich tapestry. But by this stage, London handled 80% of England's imports, and by the 19th century, it was the world's largest city, encompassing peoples from almost every country on earth. So I appreciate that that was a fairly lengthy answer to the question of what the city is, but I actually believe it was necessary. Because recent events have oversimplified the definition for many. Understandably, there is widespread misconception that the city is only synonymous with bankers, greed, and a lack of trust. And it is, of course, about much, much more than that. But a wider appreciation and understanding of the greater role is something that we continually need to earn. I've mentioned the city's professional diversity and its rich history, and yet there is more. Perhaps my greatest qualification for standing here is my own heritage. I've mentioned Walthamstow, that great borough in wider London. When I was first introduced to it, it was Essex. And so some will know how delightful it was for me to be referred to as an Essex girl. But my roots were in the Caribbean. And to be transplanted into the London of 1960s was a phenomenally interesting experience. Because where I lived, I had next door an Orthodox synagogue, a shul, to the right. Across the road was the shopkeepers, run by the most wonderful family, the Patels. So an Islamic influence. All around me were traditional Londoners who hailed from all parts of the United Kingdom and Europe. And those influences, those flavors, the changes in our food, our music, our art, our literature, influenced us all in a way that many of us were not even conscious, because our food changed, our music changed, our literature changed, our language changed as we melded together. And from that eclectic mix, some very dynamic and fascinating and exciting changes came with it. But I am myself an amalgam. I'm part African, part Caribbean Indian, part French, part Scots. So a real Caribbean mélange and child of the Commonwealth. In which other city would I ever have each of the elements of my heritage reflected but London? And that has, of course, also made me perhaps a typical Londoner, sharing many identities in a happy mélange. And from the age of 10, I would on occasion be allowed to accompany my father, if I was good, at 4:30 in the morning to buy meat from Smithfield, fish from Billingsgate, and vegetables from Spitalfields. Now you may say, why would someone do that? Was that cruel and inhumane punishment? But you have to understand, there were 12 siblings in my family. So it was a bit like running a little hotel, and you had to buy wholesale. And those experiences helped me to appreciate the real guts of London. And they are experiences which I don't think I will ever forget, but they may well stand me in good stead if I ever have the great and singular privilege of sitting on the Corporation of London's Markets Committee. Now, the good news back then was that I was rewarded for my efforts by the best salt beef sandwich before school you have ever tasted. And less rewarding back then, but fundamental to everything I have achieved, is it enabled me to see why the city was so special and to appreciate its variety. Because my father was a Methodist, my mother was a Catholic, and I told you about the halal butcher, very good food, and the Orthodox synagogue where I grew to love latkes. So it led me to my very first job. I was 15, office junior in Bishopsgate. And I could never have imagined there, working in an office as an office junior in a textile business, that I would one day have the great privilege to be Bishopsgate Alderman. And I know the enormity of the honor that has been paid to me. But I mention all of this for a reason. I lived in London. I worked in the city. And yet banks were not on my radar. The city was and is about much, much more than that. And throughout most of its history, the city has been an emblem of quality, authenticity, and entrepreneurial aspiration. It offers a stamp of authority. Working, living, trading have all been associated with a degree of pride. And 600 years ago, this building that we are now in was 4 years old. A gathering of the great and the good of London back then would have been packed with wool, cotton, and wheat merchants. In the centuries that have followed, the city has been a place associated with wealth, trading it, accumulating it, lending it, investing it, and at the center of every transaction within the maelstrom of activity have been people and their relationships between them. It was the city's role to understand the value of an investment and the risk involved, to know what to invest in and what to avoid, to understand the personalities of the individuals to whom it was lending and their appetite for risk, to gather enough insight into the projects being funded to evaluate their likely benefits to society. In that way, the Industrial Revolution may have developed in the factories of the North, but it was powered by the city. A city that understood the value and purpose of a product. A city that funded tunnels and railways, that demanded fair social practices, and that eventually came to protect workers' rights. I'm not sure whether the lyrics from Mary Poppins have ever been quoted in the Guildhall. But you may remember the scene where the children visit their father's bank. It is defined not by its complexity, but by its simplicity. The bank is kind of stuffy and stodgy, but it is easy to understand. As the bank director, Mr. Dawes, explains to the children, it is a place where you invest your tuppence to invest in railways through Africa, dams across the Nile, fleets of ocean greyhounds, majestic canals, and plantations of ripening tea. Now, if I had the voice of the sheriff, I would have sung it for you. This was finance with a purpose, dependent on interpersonal relationships and desired outcomes that were mutually beneficial to both parties. Our very language is littered with phrases that pay testament to the solidity and reliability of the banks. Safe as houses. You can bank on me. It is bankable. And there are so many, many more. The bank itself may have been, in the film, a little dull for the bank's children and for their nanny, but there was no doubting its dependability or reliability. And yet, I am here being asked whether we need the city anymore, whether we need the very engine that has powered so much for so long. And the reason the question is being asked is not simply because there has been a financial crisis, but because the very essence of the city, which has evolved over all those centuries, is under threat. In my opinion, and I know I am not alone in this view, the financial crisis was a direct result of that shift. A shift that has seen deals done with no tangible benefit to anyone but the financier. Finance for the sake of finance. The city began to take risks for others, whilst using ever more complex instruments to keep itself safe. Complex tools are not inherently bad, but they have to be wielded with skill and precision and properly understood. And it's never safe to put a complex, difficult instrument into the hands of those who do not fully understand the fundamental premises upon which that instrument is based. So although many have blamed the pure mathematicians and the physicists for the difficulties which the financial sector has experienced in the last few years, I'm not sure that it's entirely fair, because the algorithms developed by those physicists and mathematicians were not static. They should have been recalibrated as facts and circumstances changed. And when the makers of the original algorithm cautioned against their continued use without adaptation, they should have been better listened to. What is bad is a cavalier attitude that happily reaps rewards in the good time, but reacts to failure with the pointing of a finger. A culture that has lost the fundamental understanding of the value and purpose of a product is a dangerous place to be. As Lehman fell and the crisis unraveled and the die was cast, things started to come away. The city ceased to be perceived as a place for safety and respectability. It was now seen from the outside as a home for gamblers, risk-takers, and pirates. A place making a clear correlation which was evident between the ever-increasing complexity of the deals being made and the ever-decreasing level of relationships between people, and plunging the levels of trust in those making them. Losing trust is easily done. Regaining it is a Herculean task. And yet it is a task that we must now take on, because banking seems far too often to be characterized as synonymous with wrongdoing. The tax affairs of individuals and companies are never far from the headlines. The Financial Conduct Authority has just launched an investigation into the competitiveness of the entire investment banking industry, and banking scandals have escalated quickly into political scandals. The activisms of politicians such as Andrew Tyree and Margaret Hodge has been evident even this week. Ministers, CEOs, chairmen are all held to account before Parliament and the public. And it isn't just politicians asking difficult questions of the city. So are shareholders. Is the universal banking model the best for society? Are banks too big? Have regulators figured out what to do about the biggest of them? Who do you hold to account for wrongdoing? These are good times for those with qualifications in compliance. Departments grow and rules multiply, and yet, as Tacitus put it so succinctly, in a state where corruption abounds, laws must be very numerous. Which is why we mustn't just focus on controlling the problem, but on its cause. I found myself talking to a really delightful man at an event the other night. I was in Doha at the World Health Summit, and we were discussing the weather. And after a couple of minutes, I asked him what he did, and he answered that he worked in banking. And I have every reason to believe he was a really good man. And as he said it, his eyes sank momentarily to his feet, and he was palpably embarrassed to be associated with the financial sector and embarrassed by his own profession when he sort of confessed that he was a banker. And that made me actually feel very sad. Because in my view, he is not simply a victim of extraordinary sequence of events over the past decade, because his shame is not about the city and not what the city created, but about the parts of it and about what part of it have become. The city needs to look back into its own past to grasp its future. It needs to redefine itself as a force for good, an engine that powers the real economy. It needs a fundamental shift of emphasis back to true transparency, back to straightforward dealing, back to understanding the value and purpose of the product for the client, back to an environment where people feel it is okay to take risks they understand, where there is tangible upside, where it is okay to say that you have made a mistake and acceptable to learn from that mistake as long as it was made honestly and in good faith. And a system is put in place to ensure that no one makes it again the next time. The city has to become an enabling environment once again, where you can have good governance, treat people well, and still, yes, still, make a profit, where machines facilitate human relationships but do not replace them. And that's the nub. We have mentioned the city's history, its institutions, its building, and its infrastructure. But at the heart of all have been its people, without whom it has no soul. And the demise in the perception of the city has gone hand in hand with the city's lack of respect for people. And I'm not suggesting a change in its function, simply a change of approach to doing what it does best once again, serving the people of London and beyond and becoming the mirror through which the world judges itself and best practice, through the provision of exceptional financial services, governance, and the rule of law. Now, I referred to the Herculean task of making this happen. Well, it has been achieved before. After the South Sea bubble of 1720, the then Chancellor, was found guilty of the following: of the most notorious, dangerous, and infamous corruption, and he was sent to the Tower. But with the help of Robert Walpole, the company and the city survived and flourished. 6 years later, Daniel Defoe described London as vast numbers of people compelled to seek their livelihood by begging, robbing, stealing, cheating, pimping, forswearing, flattering, suborning, forging, gaming, lying, and fawning. But it cleaned up its act and moved on. Take the more recent public hysteria stirred up by the media and the call for every bank to be audited and that audit to be published for the people that followed the collapse of the Royal British Bank in 1865. We can start again, and we have to. Let's remember that the city is not full of crooks and vagabonds. The livery companies oversee much wonderful charitable work. The City Bridge Trust provides grants of over £15 million each year, investing in Londoners' young people, not in employment, education, training, and other great causes. On the very day I became an alderman, the court approved a significant award to the Trust to alleviate the difficulties suffered by those suffering from domestic violence, which many in this room know is a real passion of mine, because domestic violence affects 1 in 3 women in our world, killing and injuring more women and girls globally than anything else. In our own country, it affects 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men, between 750 and 950,000 children. And it is a scourge. And so the city, working with passion and energy with the charitable sector to change that, is something we need to be extraordinarily proud of. The Livery gave £42 million to good causes just in 2010. And there are many banks where, since long before the crises, employees leave for an hour at lunchtime to work with children from local schools. And yet even that is not enough. Charity must not be an act of penitence, casting an artificial light over a dark soul. The city will only truly be respected once again when it is run for people and where profits reflect the greater good being created for society outside. Now, having challenged the question, as my legal training demanded, I guess I should now also answer it. And I appreciate that I haven't quite done that yet, but I do hope that my answer won't surprise you. Of course, we need the city, whoever and wherever we are, but we need the right city, not a city that remains preeminent because it is fortunate enough to be situated in a convenient time zone, or because it speaks English, but one that stands for all that is good about the global financial services, one that has a clear and fair regulatory environment, one that fosters innovation and international connections, one that encourages diversity and transparency in all areas. We need a city that understands that doctors do not exist to carry out operations. They exist to save lives. That teachers do not exist to give detentions, but to inspire future generations. And that bankers do not exist to make money, but to facilitate financial security, innovation, and economic growth, and to serve their clients. My own experience in London were formative and enlightening, but they were not always easy. And the city is considerably more diverse and empathetic now. Tacitus referred to Londinium as a town of the highest repute. Let us strive to regain that reputation and to become the arbiter of good. We live in an era where trust is at a premium, where it has been lost in politics, in the health service, and in the press. Let us all strive to win it back through clearer definitions, clearer understanding, and clearer responsibilities. This, in turn, I truly believe, will lead to a clearer appreciation of its worth and an acknowledgement of its rewards. In short, the city needs to show it is part of the fabric of a fair society once more, and it is going to take all of us, every single one of us, to make that happen. We must take individual responsibility and collective action. And this is a choice. It's a choice that we all have. And we have to choose good governance. We have to choose the rule of law. And if we choose to do so, as I know we will, then we will have a financial sector supported by the lawyers, the actuaries, the insurers, and everyone else associated with it. And we will be fit to lead the wider city into the next 100 years. Our history tells us it can be done. And every day, as I talk to those who work in the city, I know it is being done. And one of the things that we all have to do is to make sure that those who work and strive daily to give to others, to make a difference, are the voices which are heard, as opposed to those who would take us in a different direction. So, no pressure there, then, ladies and gentlemen. It's all down to you. Thank you very much.